I'm the Director of Development for the Addison, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We're grateful to you for your generous support. I know many of you supported Andover and the Addison last week during PA Giving Day, which let us meet our participation targets, and that released matching funds in support of the school and the museum. And of course, some of you have provided general museum support for years, while some are new to our friends group. And I know a few people who signed up have helped underwrite museum exhibitions and art acquisitions, or have included gifts to our endowment or gifts to in their estate plans, for which we thank you all. You may have heard that we're starting the Addison Artists Council to give emerging artists their first solo US museum shows, along with the residency here on campus. This builds on a long list of important firsts at the Addison. In addition, a generous alumni family has recently offered to add 25% to major gifts to the museum's endowments. So today's talk is offered in gratitude to you for your past support, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that if you had thoughts on your future support of the Addison, you know how to find me, and I'd be happy to explore your ideas with you. Now, I'm not sure that many positives came out of the pandemic, but even though we're now back to holding events in person here at the Addison, we realized how many of you, of our wonderful supporters really, have been able to join us online, letting us connect with those of you who aren't here in the Andover region, hence today's event. We've all become accustomed to online talks, but I wanted to go over a few quick items. Please note we're recording today's talk and we'll make it available online in a few weeks. Feel free to turn off your camera though if you're not comfortable with having your own image on that. Also, you'll note on the upper right-hand side of the screen under View, you can select Speaker View or Gallery View. Also, we're going to reserve time at the end of the talk for questions, so please mute yourself and during this talk, but you can unmute at the end to ask questions, or if you'd like, you can put it into the chat, and we'll see how many of those we can get to at the end as well. Well, so today we're in for a treat. I'll look at just a few of the Addison's latest acquisitions with Ali Kemmerer, the Addison's Mary Strip and R. Crosby Kemper director, along with Gordon Wilkins, our Robert M. Walker Curator of American Art. You probably know that the Addison's collection consists of more than 25,000 works in all media. That's painting, sculpture, photography, drawings, prints, and decorative arts from the 18th century to the present. That sounds like a lot, but obviously the collection isn't complete and it isn't static. My colleagues are tasked with what I think is an enviable, and I'm sure it's a difficult task, to flesh out the collection with new works, to fill voids, tell previously overlooked stories, reach broader audiences. Ali and Gordon add new treasures regularly, and I look forward to hearing them tell us about a handful of the many works that have just recently come into the collection. So please let us begin with Ali and Gordon.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending. David mentioned the Addison Artists Council, which will give annually an artist their first solo museum show, as well as a residency and an acquisition. And we are actually coming to you from San Francisco, visiting that first artist, Reggie Burroughs Hodges, whose show we will present in September. So we are super excited. We've done a studio visit with him, and we very much look forward to hopefully all of you coming to see that show. And in the future, we'll be reporting on a new acquisition of Reggie's. But for today, we just chose a few of the many works that have recently entered the collection. There were so many we could have chose from, but our selections were guided by the desire to show a range of media, time periods, artists, and also the many different ways works are added to the collection. As further criteria, our selection was restricted to things that haven't yet been exhibited, so that you are getting a sneak preview. But I'm going to break that for those of you who are close to the Addison and or able to visit before the end of July. we have two magnificent new acquisitions, two paintings that are in the exhibition Women and Abstraction 1741 to the Present. They are paintings by Libby Mark and Hedda Stern. Really strong, significant works that are by artists who weren't represented in the Addison's collection before. So I urge you to come see those two works if you can, and the show itself, which is spectacular. Gordon curated that. So I'm going to pass it off to Gordon to start. We promised we'd be brief so that we can chat together at the end.
Thank you, Allie. And oops, there we go. So we're going to start at the very beginning, and I'm sure this will be familiar territory for many of you, but it's important to think about the origin of the Addison's collection, and particularly how that informs what we are acquiring by a variety of means to this day. So the Addison was founded in the late 1920s, opened to the public in May of 1931. And when it opened to the public, the Addison had a collection of around 400 works of art, the vast majority of which came from a single source. They were all donated anonymously. It was a fairly poorly kept secret. So the works, as well as the endowment for the Addison, which still sustains us in many ways to this day, and the core collection of the Addison and our building, et cetera, came from really one man, Thomas Cochrane, who's pictured on the screen here. He was a member of the Phillips Academy class of 1890, went on to be a college football player, later coach, and then turned his attention to banking, worked for JP Morgan's firm in New York, was quite a well-known financial mind of his time, actually anticipated the Depression in many respects. He was not necessarily an art collector, though, prior to his desire to really radically transform Phillips Academy's campus, which he did with the architect Charles Platt over several years from the late 1930s up until his death in the late 1920s up until his death in the mid 1930s. But the crown jewel, at least we like to think of his philanthropic efforts at Phillips Academy, is the Addison. So in the terms of trust, which is a document that we continue to be sort of bound to follow, Thomas Cochrane notes, bent on a desire to enrich permanently the lives of the students of Phillips Academy by helping to cultivate and foster in them a love for the beautiful, I should be glad to establish at the Academy, if entirely acceptable to the Board of Trustees, an endowed gallery of American art. So what was in this core collection? So in the about approximately 400 paintings, and they came in waves. So there was an initial gift of a few dozen works in 1928, and many of those were put on view in what is known as the trustees room at Phillips Academy. Then it was determined that that there ought to be a more suitable place for the display of a collection of that caliber. Even before the Addison opened its doors, we had several works by Winslow Homer. We had a wonderful Whistler, Aikens pieces, etc. And Cochrane set about funding the construction of the building and then amassing a core opening day collection, which included, these are just three of the, as I said, around 400 works that were on view, or not necessarily all on view at the same time, but in the collection when the museum opened, including, of course, our famous 8 Bells, which was, at the time of its purchase, the most expensive American painting of all time. Thomas Cochrane purchased it for about $60,000 in 1930, which is well over $1 million adjusted for inflation today. You have work by Maria Oki Doing, one of the few women. I think, unfortunately, it's probably not surprising that our core collection is not particularly rich when it comes to diversity. There were essentially works by Maria Oki Doing and Marie Cassatt. Those were more or less the two women represented in the core collection. Of course, there were no artists of color incorporated in the initial gift, and we'll look at some of the ways that we've been working to add nuance and diversity to our collection. And then not everything came from Thomas Cochrane, though most did. This incredible Whistler was a gift of Cornelius Bliss, who was very connected. The Bliss family in general was very connected to the Addison, and they were very important in New York art collecting circles. So one thing I'll note, and this is I think somewhat difficult to discuss, particularly in this day and age. But when you look at the terms of trust, when it comes to collecting, we're bound by what kind of sounds like a rather idiosyncratic, strange policy, but is very much rooted in its time, where Thomas Cochrane, when he established the Addison, was doing something that was really radical. Because at that time, there were really only a handful of institutions in the United States that paid any attention to American art. American art was really widely considered to be European pastiche at the time. That opinion didn't really change until the post-World War II period. So people were just not taking it seriously. And I think Thomas Cochrane was aware of that and worried, very worried, because he wanted to really respect the art of country, which is engraved above the entry to the Addison. And he didn't want his museum to turn into an encyclopedic museum. He didn't want this museum that he had intended to serve as this great repository of American art to turn into a museum that had American art, Asian art, African art, etc., an encyclopedic museum, for example. So we are allowed to house paintings, sculpture, silver, and other works of art or craftsmanship produced by a native-born or naturalized citizen of the United States. To this condition, there may be the following exceptions, namely temporary loan exhibits and photographs and books produced or by authors other than native-born or naturalized citizens of the United States. Likewise, there may be housed in the Addison Gallery scale models of famous ships connected with the history of the United States. That's actually, we've exploited that loophole to great effect with our amazing Yinka Shonibari. Also, items of English silver produced by other than native-born or naturalized citizens of the United States, but otherwise approved by the Addison Gallery Committee and the Board of Trustees. And then he later expanded it to allow for portraits of busts of Americans and portrayals of American scenes or vessels by artists of foreign birth, so hence the amazing Yinka Shonibari, produced not later than 1800, and pieces of pottery or glass or of whatever origin or date decorated with American scenes. So you can see as it is truly idiosyncratic. So we work within these constraints, although I think there's a lot of creativity that can be found in constraints. And you'd be surprised by the depth and breadth of our collection. People think that this is very restrictive, and to an extent it is, but I think it's allowed us to be really focused and allowed us to amass what is considered to be one of the finest collections of American art in the world. And then the size of the collection as of April 1st, we started off with around 400 works. We're now, as was mentioned prior, up to over 25,000. You can see the vast majority, over half of the collection is comprised of photographs, which Ali will speak on in just a little bit. So with over 13,000 works within the realm of photography, around 900 paintings, 490 sculptures, 355 works of decorative arts, which is not a major focus of our collection. 5,358 works on paper, 5,293 prints, 25 ship models, and then we have a category of miscellaneous works, which I can't really come up with an example of what that would be, but I'm sure there are some strange miscellaneous things lurking in storage. So I'll keep talking, sorry, and then we'll switch. You'll get to hear Ali right after this. We're going to present 6 sort of case studies of recent acquisitions. And I'll start off with the recent incredibly generous donation of work by Boston School or sort of Boston School adjacent artists from the collection of George Abrams, a graduate of Phillips Academy from the class of 1950. And George Abrams is known as a collector, but he's really known as a prolific collector of Golden Age Dutch drawing. And other works on paper and paintings. And he has been incredibly generous to a number of Boston institutions over the last several decades, notably the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Harvard Art Museums, which holds a large quantity of a large portion of his collection. He has supported the Addison over the years, but he realized, just about a year ago, that he really thought that he could do something a bit more significant for the Addison. And he amassed over a period of about a decade, a collection of nearly 200 works by artists affiliated with the Boston School, and particularly those who would fall under the heading of Boston Expressionists. And what is Boston Expressionism? These are two works that are in our collection already, so we do have a nice foundation for his gift, which I'll show slides of next. These are works by the two leading figures of Boston Expressionism, Hyman Bloom and Jack Levine. Both artists working in Boston in the throughout the 20th century. You can see by their dates, they lived for quite a while. Both were really the sort of quintessential Boston Expressionists. Their work shares this kind of, well, first of all, they didn't abandon figuration for abstraction. That was one thing that really set Boston Expressionism apart. They're very influenced by German Expressionism and the sort of power of figures to convey emotion. Their work is often very dark, moody, disturbing in many cases, but often laced with this sense of humor, however bone dry it may be. Hyman Bloom in particular was really interested in spiritual themes. He was interested very clearly, as you can see from this drawing, in mortality and the body and flesh and decomposition. Jack Levine, on the other hand, well interested in spirituality to an extent, was really very much a leftist, socially engaged artist. And a lot of his work is very much in the sort of social critique style. They were also, many of these artists were also Jewish and were already sort of on the margins of Boston society at the time. And then their work takes a particularly dark turn after the full horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. What we have in this gift, though, is a great mix of early work and later work. And you'd be surprised, considering our proximity to Boston, that the Addison is rather weak when it comes to representative works by Boston-affiliated artists. I think a lot of that has to do with the Addison's close connection to New York. Many of our donors are in New York. Historically, New York has really been the center of our activities, and Boston was kind of covered by Boston institutions. But we now have this incredibly rich collection. So here are two works by Hyman Bloom, and one by Hyman Bloom, one by Jack Levine. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are over 170 works across media, primarily works on paper, but also paintings, sculptures, photograph. And what's great about this is these are both taken from their Jack Levine and Hyman Bloom's student days. So they took drawing classes together, and there's actually it's somewhat difficult to tell who did what because their style was quite similar. Another artist, Carl Picard, was also in this gift and took the same drawing classes, so that adds additional difficulty for attribution. This is a fantastic drawing by Richard Boyce, another artist who's not known really. I would say not well known, but I really don't think he's known, period. This is a great work that hints at a lot of the themes that artists were engaging with in Boston at the time. And you think of what was going on in New York in 1947, R. Jackson Pollock, Phosphorescences from 1 year later. So thinking about just how radically different and outside of this New York mainstream the artists of Boston were. They were really making work that engaged very much with realism, but again, with these heightened emotional qualities. The work is also the donation is also particularly rich in work by women artists. These are an incredible piece on the left by Mariana Pineda, and then all of the preparatory drawings as well. And I'll mention the kind of fun, and I probably have gone way too long already, but something neat about this is that George Abrams is a lawyer first and foremost, and he started practicing in the 50s, and he was always interested in art. And he represented a gallerist, a very famous gallerist in Boston by the name of Hyman Swetzoff, and he represented many of the artists in this gift. And he provided Mr. Abrams, that is, provided Swetzoff with legal services, and in lieu of payment, and he also provided services for many of his artists, and in lieu of payment, he was given works of art. So that's really why this collection came to be and how it came to be. It's never been exhibited, So it's very exciting for us to have this work that really people didn't know about. People know him as a Dutch drawing collector, not as a Boston School collector. So we now have this incredible treasure trove of over 170 works, some of which are on view currently. This piece by Reba Stewart on the left is on view in my Women in Abstraction show. We have a very rich collection of Reba Stewart, an unsung abstract artist, and Fanny Hillsmith, who was represented in our collection by one painting and one work on paper. Now we have probably the largest collection of her graphic works, which are really extraordinary. And we have different states of the printing. So really incredible resource for teaching as well, to show process and alterations of prints across striking. So it's a really exciting collection, and helps to really expand our history, the history that we're able to present of modernisms, plural, not just the New York school, but looking at what was going on outside of New York, and filling gaps in being able to represent what was really going on in our own backyard, so to speak. Allie, I'll pass it off to you.
Okay. So this case study is an example of building on strengths rather than filling gaps. Gordon mentioned the numbers of our holdings. Photography comprises more than half of the Addison's collection. Early in its history, the Addison recognized the importance of photography as an art form, and we were one of the first American museums to actively exhibit photography, presenting work by artists such as Margaret Bork White and Walker Evans as early as the 1930s, which was pretty rare. So over 90 years in the making, the Addison's photo collection has become one of the major repositories of American photography. It's comprised of individual masterworks, but also multiple prints by important photographers. And the emphasis has always been on the ways in which photographs speak to each other formally, historically, and thematically. So the significance of the collection lies in its in-depth holdings of works by key individuals, as well as theme-based groups of works by various photographers. And one of the themes that we have terrific strength in is street photography. And recently, and here you have examples of some of our street photography greats: Louis Farrer, Bernice Abbott, Robert Frank. We have the complete set of the Americans, which makes us one of only 4 museums in the world, 3 in the US, to own a complete set. It's quite a coup. Helen Levitt, we also have great works. These are just examples of some of the highlights of 20th century street photography. But we've recently gotten gifts that add to this. The first one is an incredible panorama by Todd Webb, 6th Avenue between 43rd and 44th Streets. This is taken in 1948. It consists of 8 8x10 contact prints that were montaged together to form the overall image, which is nearly 7 feet long. And I had included a version of this image in a show decades ago that explored panoramic photography, and it killed me to pack the piece up and return it to the Nelson Atkins Museum. That's where we borrowed it from. So it's really a thrill to have this now come back to the collection. This was partially purchased by the museum, but we could not have done it without the support of Andrew Scharf and Dorsey Gardner. So we are super grateful to have that. Webb was born in Detroit. He worked as a stockbroker, a gold prospector, a forest ranger, and a writer before becoming a professional photographer in 1939. In 1945, as a newly discharged Navy veteran, he moved to New York with the specific intention of photographing the city. He spent several decades capturing the city's contrasts. He traveled the city armed with a large format camera and a tripod. So setting the camera and tripod up, he photographed skyscrapers in Midtown, Lower East Side tenements, high-powered business people, and street vendors, and all together created a really insightful collective portrait of the city during the post-war period. He composed this panorama, as I said, from 8 separate images. It depicts the west side of 6th Avenue between West 43rd and 44th Streets, taken on the afternoon of March 24th, 1948. And, you know, again, and I look forward to explaining this to kids, there was no Photoshop. He realized he had to work fast. He has great writings in his journals recounting the difficulties of getting this shot. He actually worked early in the morning and he made chalk marks along the sidewalk to exactly map out where he was to put his tripod to get this seamless panorama. And he talks about working with cars whizzing by and also parked cars that would move down the street, and he couldn't have the car appear in half in one frame and not the other. So he actually successfully did it, as you can see. The image was exhibited at the 1958 Brussels World's Fair and was blown up to 4 feet by 24 feet. So it was monstrous and received with critical acclaim, and he became internationally recognized as the historian with a camera. And this is certainly a wonderful slice of history. Here's a detail. It shows the many small shops that existed in 1948. Many were bars and record shops, but on the far left, you see the Hanover House Hotel. You see that neon sign. That was where Woody Guthrie composed This Land Is Your Land. So a little tidbit. I don't think it exists anymore. But this is a significant addition to the Addisons, what were modest holdings of Todd Webb's work. And also it's accompanied by a gift of 3 additional photographs from the Todd Webb archive, which we have yet to choose, but we do want to focus on more of his urban imagery to enhance the panorama itself. And the Todd Webb archive is headed by Betsy Hunt, who is also a PA alum. So that's a nice tie-in as well. You can go to the next. Vivian Meyer. So this was another series of photographs we got from a local resident who grew up going to the Addison and just really loving the collection, but in particular the photography collection. And he has generously decided to gift us a selection of Vivian Meyer photographs each year, with the idea that after several years, we'll have an in-depth collection. So for decades, Meyer wandered around New York and Chicago, taking tens of thousands of photographs of people and scenes she encountered on the street. She was born in New York, but spent a lot of her youth in France and then worked in Chicago as a nanny and caregiver most of her life. But in her leisure time, she pursued photography, and she took, again, thousands of photographs, most of which she never printed. So over the course of 5 decades, she ultimately left behind over 100,000 negatives, which she stored in a locker. And her photography was unknown until 2007, 2 years before her death, when she fell behind on payments for this locker and the belongings were auctioned off. So she's an enigmatic, mysterious figure who's recently come to life. One of the buyers at the auction was a real estate agent, John Malouf, and he was intrigued by the photographs, found them in the locker, among other items. He was never able to connect with Meyer in her lifetime, but he was compelled to learn more about her, and he began to put these images online, and they just went viral. There was huge enthusiasm. He since has made a movie about her. Oops. And these are 2 examples. Right now, I think it's been 2 years that Dean Eastman has been giving us this work. These are 2 examples of 8 photographs that are in the collection. She does a lot of self-portraits. That's her on the left. There are lots of wonderful images of kids on the streets, but also buildings and street scenes, architecture. Overall, like Todd Webb, is sort of an incisive, comprehensive view of city life, mostly Chicago. Okay. So another subset, there's street photography. Another strength of the collection is documentary photographers. So here you have 2 great examples. Allie Mae Burroughs by Walker Evans, who is a PA alum and for whom we have over 200 photographs in the collection. And another by Eugene Richards, a really powerful portrait of a young US Marine about to ship out to Vietnam. And so war photography is a subset within documentary photography. We have a lot of material for Civil War and Vietnam by artists such as Alexandra Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan. For Vietnam, Bill Short, Dick Durrance, and Donald Blumberg. We got two amazing gifts from Wayne Miller's family. One set are World War II related photographs, and another is Chicago. Miller sought to, quote, photograph mankind and explain man to man. This ambition guided a prolific career. In World War II, he joined the Navy and was assigned to Edward Steichen's elite photographic naval aviation unit. The photographs in this gift include images of US soldiers aboard the SS Saratoga in the Pacific Theater in 1943, and women training in WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, also known as the US Naval Women's Reserve. In September 1945, a month after the US dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Miller was on the ground photographing the devastation there. So these are incredible photos and very important for us because we had very little World War II material and none from the Pacific Theater. So we're thrilled to have these, and obviously they speak to many other photographs in the collection. After the war, Miller returned to his native Chicago, and from 1946 to 1948, funded by 2 Guggenheim grants, he photographed Black communities in the South Side. Again, in quotes, he wanted to know the people that I saw and try to express how they were feeling about their daily lives and their families. And I think that sensitivity and intimacy shows through in these really powerful photographs of the Chicago community. It shows people at work, birth scenes, street scenes, weddings, sandlot, baseball games. It's a really dynamic, wonderful collection that again speaks to other things as well. Miller photographed for Life, Ebony, National Geographic. He worked with Steichen on the iconic Family of Man exhibition, and he joined Magnum in 1958. And this is the first, believe it or not, for all of his achievements, these are the first images by Miller to enter the Addison's collection. So it's a really, really special gift, and we will be using them quite often. Off to you.
Okay. So the next acquisition that we're going to discuss is by a living artist by the name of Henry Payee, who's actually quite young. He's only in his mid-30s. So this is a really spectacular work. And of course, seeing it on Zoom doesn't necessarily do it justice. But this is entirely made of collage and mixed media. So if you look, these are really precisely cut, very delicately assembled pieces of colored paper primarily, with some paint application, particularly the sky, you'll see has some paint, but very really beautifully and rendered and striking. And it actually was one of the things that Allie and I encountered at the Armory show in New York, and it was something that we really could not stop thinking about, and we had to have it because it ties in so beautifully with our collection. Should also mention that Henry Payee is a Ho-Chunk artist. He's an Indigenous American artist born in Sioux City, Iowa. He is very much on the rise. This was, I believe, his first major museum acquisition. What's so fantastic about it is first of all, we've been working really diligently to increase our own representation of work by Indigenous artists. Just a few years ago, we had one work in our collection by an Indigenous artist, the late Fritz Scholder. And since then, within our means, we've been able to acquire significant works by artists like Joan Quitchessie Smith, Cara Romero, Nicholas Galanin, and now Henry Payee. So this work is quite loaded and full of meaning, and I'll just briefly try to dissect some of that. So you look at this format of the side-by-side images. Immediately, if you are familiar with 19th century photography, it's evocative of stereo cards. And those are two images that are just slightly different, that when you put them next to each other and look at it through a certain type of optical device, the two images merge in your field of vision and create this depth, this three-dimensional effect. So really kind of the original 3D experience. Or I guess real life is kind of the original 3D experience, but at least in 2D media. So you have here the stereo view in our collection by Carlton Watkins. This is a work that documents the California genocide. This is essentially a photograph of captured indigenous Californians in what was more or less a concentration camp. So it's a very loaded, heavy, difficult image. But this is the kind of material. So he's representing not only the form of the stereo card, which is this way to sort of translate three-dimensionality in 2 dimensions, but he's also referencing things like ethnographic photography. On the left is something that could almost be a direct inspiration for the 2 female figures seated atop horses in the Henry Payee piece. This is a work by the incredibly famous Edward Curtis, who spent years and went bankrupt and probably mad working on what ended up being a 20-volume series called The North American Indian. And we are very, very, very fortunate to have a complete set on deposit at the Addison on long-term loan, and that's part of the Stephen C. Sherrill Collection of American Art Foundation. So we are very excited to begin to work with the North American Indian portfolio. There are 20 portfolio boxes full of over 1,000 images, and then 20 bound volumes. So it's a massive, incredible undertaking, one of the most significant publications in the history of photography and books. The other thing that's really amazing and adds to the layering of history, of meaning in this work, is that Henry Payee uses ledger paper as his substrate. So he's building a top ledger paper that he finds going to various antique stores in the Midwest. So ledger paper was the kind of the source of paper for indigenous Americans, particularly Plains tribes. So we have an example of a ledger drawing. That's probably the most famous sort of one of the more famous indigenous art forms of the 19th century. These were, this paper could be found at various forts or by different Indian agents who would use it to keep records. But it was given to indigenous people, and they sort of translated what had been an extant craft, an artistic practice of hide painting on buffalo hides, and they translated that onto paper. So it's this really interesting sort of appropriation of the colonizers' materials to make art that speaks and is really documentary. It's speaking to the lived experience of the indigenous people facing marginalization, forced relocation, genocide, essentially. Unfortunately, we don't have any ledger drawings in our collection. This is an example from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but hopefully that will change and we'll be able to better contextualize this new piece. And finally, what's sort of the most forceful messaging behind this work is Henry Payee's commentary on cultural appropriation. So the title of the work is a Siouan word. It's pronounced Chi-se-dich, and it's Siouan for longhouse, which is a type of a long lodge that was used for a medicine lodge and clan festivities, specifically for the Ho-Chunk Nation. So this is a form of architecture that Henry Payee, as a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, is intimately acquainted with. What's also interesting is that Ho-Chunk people are also, that's an umbrella term, but then there's the Winnebago tribe underneath this larger umbrella of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And so what he's doing is making a really interesting commentary on the inability or ability to travel, and then looking at how, and that comes through his use of reappropriation of Winnebago imagery. So Winnebago, the motor coach company, took its name from the Winnebago people. They're based in Iowa, I believe, and they also used words with native connotations to market their mobile longhouses, essentially, which is what Henry Payer is looking at in a kind of a bitingly humorous way. So I thought this was a really interesting side by side. So you have an ethnographic photograph from early 20th century of a longhouse, and then you have the Winnebago Brave. There's also the Chieftain. In this advertisement from 1972, which I won't go into depth, but essentially it's in front of this reconstructed kind of living history museum of ancient Puebloan dwellings. So this sort of like multiple layers of appropriation of indigenous identity going on in these works. So in this piece, he's looking at different modes of transportation, thinking about the Winnebago, kind of indigenizing the Winnebago, looking at the Winnebago as I'm talking about the motorhome, as a longhouse on wheels of sorts, and sort of taking it back, taking that really dark history of continued cultural appropriation back. But he's, it's humorous, but it is a really strong critique of dominant cultures' appropriation of Indigenous American cultures, symbols, and iconography in order to service the needs of capitalism, thinking of things like Land O'Lake Butter or the Braves, the Chiefs, various sports teams. What's also interesting is that thinking about the forced migration, expulsion of Native peoples from their ancestral lands, and this inability, this forced movement, and then inability once Native peoples were on reservations to leave reservations, and then contrasting it with what Winnebago is trying to market, which is the freedom of the open road. So it's this really strong kind of push and pull here, where he's looking at and undoing the sort of layers of meaning of the Winnebago Corporation, and thinking about how this object, this motorhome that symbolizes the freedom to pick up and go wherever within the continuous United States you want to go, how they're taking on an identity or appropriating an identity of a people who have been marginalized, kept really, and had their travel restricted and were unable to kind of move or live where they wanted to live or where they traditionally live. So it's this very rich, powerful work that we are really excited to work with and to use. And this is just another in what we hope will be many upcoming acquisitions of important work by particularly living Indigenous artists. And I'll turn it back to Allie for Laddie John Dill.
Okay, I see we're running long, so I will speed along here. So you can go to the first slide. Laddie John Dill is a classic light and space artist working in Southern California. He was raised in part by a mathematician stepfather who helped develop night vision technologies and would leave electronic equipment scattered around his house. And Laddie John recalls that he grew up with laser beams running down the hall and his stepfather yelling, "Don't touch that or you'll die," that kind of thing. And these are things that he actually works with now. He studied painting and sculpture at the Chouinard Art Institute, but moved toward unconventional materials such as light, glass, and sand after receiving his BFA in 1968. It was fellow artist Robert Irwin that introduced him to Rio Score's custom neon sign shop in Los Angeles. And this is where he learned how to manipulate electrified gases like argon, helium, mercury, neon, and xenon. I have no idea what that is, and how to weld, shape, and color glass tubing. He applied these skills to his art practice, and he began creating these light sentences. And here is a really important early example of those wall-mounted sculptures that comprise thin, straight neon fixtures made of radiant sequences of multicolored light. They can hang vertically or horizontally. And he sees these, he's solely interested in the relationships that these works create between light, color, glass, gas, and electric charge. But there's something so magical and transportive about them. This acquisition is not only a prime example of his work, but it comes on the heels of a show we presented last year, 2 years ago, Light Space Surface, works from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. This was a major exhibition of works by Dill, but also artists like Larry Bell, Judy Chicago, Mary Corse, Robert Irwin, and James Terrell. And it was enthusiastically received by our visitors, and actually in the Boston Globe got the top 10 show of the year list. And I think part of that is because many were unaware of this important Southern California movement. And on top of that, it really was the first time that work had been shown in such a cohesive way on the East Coast. And one of the reasons we wanted to show that exhibition was because it included artists that weren't in our collection. It gave us the opportunity to present their work, but also an opportunity to present what we feel is a really, well, what everybody feels is a really important period of American art history. So we're thrilled to be adding this first significant work by a light and space artist to the collection. And we hope over time others will join it. But in the meantime, next slide. There are many objects from our holdings, particularly minimalist works. Here we have a painting by Bryce Martin, titled Third Figure, which I think they speak to each other. They beautifully resonate with one another. So we can see it joining forces with the multitude of minimalist works or geometric works we have in our collection. Next slide. Also with its clear reference to the 1969 moon landing, the work itself is called Rising Moon. We can be playful with it. We envision creating surprising juxtapositions, perhaps pairing it with Winslow Homer's Kissing the Moon, or the many photographs we have of the 1969 lunar landing. Next slide. And of course, lots of connections can be made between it and objects by other artists similarly exploring light and the transcendence of light. So on the left, we have a photogram by Adam Foose. And on the right, we have one example of an entire series we have of Berenice Abbott's science pictures. Oh, and then just a reminder in terms of, maybe we go back to the light for one quick second. One of the other reasons that the Light Space Surface show was such a success was the ways it allowed us to teach. And this show in particular engaged science students, both from Phillips Academy and other schools. In fact, there was one project that involved a collaboration between PA students and Doherty Middle School kids right down the road, where the PA students chose an object from the Light Space Surface show and created instructional videos that explained principles of light, and then shared them with the middle schoolers who incorporated that into their unit, their science unit on light. So that was a wonderful collaboration, and Dill was one of the objects that actually inspired one of those videos. So we're always thinking, you know, when we're thinking about adding objects to the collection, of course, it's what do we think is the most important and interesting American art being created, and what kind of conversations will it spark with other things already in the collection, but also how can we access this object through multiple disciplines? So just insight into how we choose. Off to Patty Chang.
So now we're on to Patty Chang. So we've covered a lot of ground as to reasons behind acquisitions. With this piece, which is a really significant video-based work by the contemporary Chinese-American performance artist and video artist Patty Chang, this kind of serves multiple purposes for us. Asian American artists are, you know, notoriously underrepresented in museums of American art. The Addison, unfortunately, is not an exception to the rule, although we do have certain significant works, and we've certainly added a very significant one with this piece by Asian American artists in our collection. But it's a continued area that we see as being, you know, full of potential for growth and development of our collection of Asian American artists, not just contemporary Asian American artists, but looking back historically. And there are some really incredible artists whose work we hope to add over time to the Addison's collection. Patty Chang, this is also really exciting because the Addison it doesn't necessarily have a particularly large collection of video art or performance-based work. So this is sort of a 2-for-1. It's a performance piece, but also a video piece, and it joins work by artists like Nick Cave, Kara Walker, as one of the most significant out of a small group, but of video pieces, but will hopefully lead to future acquisitions. So Patty Chang was born in 1972, and she's really well known for a series of works that she did early on in her career. I should mention first, this is a video, and of course, this is you aren't getting the full experience of a video, because I knew if I tried to show a video in the middle of this, that everything would crash and I would fail miserably at it. But we can send a link to a clip of this. But basically what it is, it's not too hard to grasp, is Patty Chang herself dressed in this sort of work kind of corporate American outfit. And she's walking on this field in New Jersey in this backyard. And you start to see her struggling to walk. And you see this, it almost appears as though the ground underneath her feet is liquid. And that's because it is. What she did is she took a waterbed, took it outside, and then placed sod or turf on top of it. And she had started this this kind of investigation of the instability of walking on water in an artist residency at the World Trade Center the year before 9/11 in 2000. She was an artist in residence. It was the Lower East Side artist residency, something like that. And she did a video that's incredibly haunting and prescient of herself walking in a hallway at the top of one of the towers. And she's walking on a waterbed, and she's shaking and kind of stumbling and trying to hold on to her balance. And this work is called Losing Ground. This is a later work that sort of more fully realizes her vision. She's also referencing American art history. If you look at her garment here and then look at works like Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World, she's very aware of the references that she's making and of how her work is situated within American art history. I first was acquainted with her work when I was about 10 years old at the RISD Museum in Providence, where I grew up. There was the video on the left was on view, In Love, which was pretty radical for a 10-year-old. She is pictured here on the left with her mother, and then on the right with her father. And the video is really haunting and in slow motion and reverses, but the white thing that they're holding is an onion, and it's Patty Chang eating an onion, sort of Lady and the Tramp style, with her parents. And there was just something about it that was so disquieting, but kind of curious and enticing. And I think this critic, Eve Oishi, who writes about Patty Chang's work in a publication, Camera Obscura, says it far better than I could. She says, quote, "Her performance pieces can best be described as balancing acts, not only in the way she manipulates her body, but in her ability to create works that juxtapose absolute stillness with explosive tension, sly humor with incisive revelation, and penetrating commentary with emotional force." The piece on the right, unfortunately, neither of these are in our collection, but these are really signature works by Patty Chang. On the right is a piece called Eels, which that quote that I just read, where you think you're seeing something, and then over time, your perception is totally destabilized, and you realize there's something else going on. So in this video piece, you see her sitting with her back to the wall with this skirt and a blouse. And then you start to see things wriggling under her shirt. And if you have seen the title, it gives it away. She had eels, live eels under her shirt, and you see her starting to sort of writhe in pain, or is it ecstasy? It's this sort of ambiguity and enigma that makes her work so captivating. And then also, really all about female agency. I had this pairing in mind early on, and I think we'll be able to make this a reality in September, which Several of these works, just to plug an upcoming show that we're doing this fall, several of these works will appear in an exciting permanent collection show that Allie, our new curator, Rachel Vogel, and I are working on, along with our curatorial fellow, Tessa Height, which will situate several new acquisitions in context with the larger permanent collection. So each gallery will be anchored, of our second floor, will be anchored by a different acquisition. And Patty Chang's Losing Ground will anchor one gallery. So I'm thinking that this kind of, that I became really interested in this dynamic of the female figure in nature and the forces of nature acting against the body. And you see that really in full display in Winslow Homer's West Wind, which is something that you would that would probably happen nowhere else in the world, would you see Patty Chang next to Winslow Homer. But that's the beauty of the Addison, and that we mix media, we take risks, we do playful things, we do things that maybe this will totally backfire, but we're experimental and we like to do things that are a little bit different. She's also referencing the greats of performance art, Vito Acconci being one of them. This incredible work called Jumps from 1969, which is sort of a photo / performance documentation work, where he is doing something kind of similar to Patty Chang, where he's taking these very precise, defined movements, studying them carefully, and then capturing them on film. It also resonates really beautifully with motion photography, early 19th century or 19th century work like Edward Muybridge's Stumbling and Falling on the Ground. We have the complete set of animal locomotion in our collection. It also resonates with works by artists like June Leith, this kind of electric kind of vibrating almost figure of perhaps a woman running. You don't quite know, but it's it straddles abstraction and figuration in this interesting way. And then this idea of losing ground and the sort of earth giving way under your feet and falling and stumbling, something as seemingly unrelated as Robert Capa's famed Falling Soldier from 1936 could even be put in dialogue with the Patty Chang work. And for our final case study, I'll turn it back to Allie.
Okay, the first slide. So this painting is one from an incredibly impressive body of work that Lavon Jenkins has produced over the past 6 months as the Addison's Edward E. Elson Artist in Residence. It is brand new. It is thick, luscious, juicy paint that you can still smell it. And we did break the rule for this. This is actually on view in a small focus show that gives you just a taste of what Lavon's been doing over at the Abbott Artist Studio over these past few months. But he creates these sculptural works that, from pouring, squeezing, slathering pigment with brushes, palette knives, syringes, he incessantly works and reworks his compositions, but remains open to fortuitous drips and spills. And just the end result is something that really is provocatively pushing the boundaries of what a painting can be. He really revels in the materiality of paint. He's also inspired by a range of sources from art history. You can see the reference with these hooded figures in the back to Philip Guston. Also, personal memory plays a large part. He's also referencing fascism, racism, activism. And again, all of these things are part of his ongoing quest to redefine painting. The works in this series, this painting is part of a larger series called The Weight of Things, but he honors specific women. Our painting is Lizzo. I don't know if you were able to guess that. The women in the paintings are celebrities like Lizzo, but they're also family members and friends, and they're all people who have inspired Lavon and made a positive difference in the larger world. They're all dazzling color, dynamic patterns that surround the women, that exude joy and celebrate the influence of Black culture on contemporary fashion, which he's really interested in. But on the flip side, the menacing hooded figures, the Guston references that loom over, suggest a more troubled history. That's the weight and enduring trauma. And grounding all of this complex referentiality are the protectors, these big-headed little Nike Air Jordan wearing figures who flank the women with gloved fists ready to stand and protect them and fight injustice. The next image is Lavon in the studio, and those little protectors have a lot of resemblance to Lavon, and I think there's a lot of self-portraiture in those figures. But here he is in the studio, and one of the amazing things about this residency is that often we can't get an artist to stay for such a long chunk of time. Lavon is going actually on 7 months in the studio. Normally artists come for repeated visits throughout a year or just shorter, several week visits. So it's been such a gift for us and the students and all of the community to be able to pop in and out of the studio over this time and see a work evolve from start to finish. Watch him make decisions, switch courses, really get into his brain and understand what the artistic process and how he works. So we are so grateful for that. And it's been just the model of a residency in that, it supports a living artist, but it also reflects the Addison's firm belief that it's not only engaging with art, but artists that are valuable for our audiences. So next slide. Again, the way we'll use our painting, Lavon leaves soon, and we will be really sad to part with him, but we're very happy to have this painting to commemorate this experience. One way, of course, is to explore the art history he references, and here is our Guston painting. Next slide. Another way would be to pair him with artists who similarly revel in the thickness and luscious paint. So we have a painting by Joan Snyder on the left, which actually is currently on view in the Abstraction Show. And on the right, a large-scale painting by Sam Messer, who happens to be a friend of Lavon's. Next slide. And finally, fun, just the idea of fashion and strong women, portraiture, and patterning. I could see playing this painting against photographs by Jonathan Becker, Patricia Herrera at home, and a brand new Micheline Thomas we have. So many ways to use the work, very versatile. And if you're here in the near future, Lavon is still in the studio. He's produced lots of work and it's a real treat. It's open doors at all times. So I urge you to come visit if you can. And I think that's it.
Yes.
2:05. Sorry, everyone.
But if there are, we would be delighted to take any questions if there are any. And we can talk about things that you've seen, if you have questions about things you've seen or questions about how we make decisions or how we acquire works in general. Feel free to unmute and ask anything you'd like.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Edward Buckby. I'm in Cambridge, and I'm curious to know, obviously the market, especially for photographs, is much more active. There are more players, there are more institutions trying to build up their collections. I'm wondering what sets the Addison apart. Like when you're making a pitch for something, a collection or a very famous photograph, what do you say about the Addison that you think will make a difference in how the decisions are made, or are they purely financial? Something tells me that there's a lot of emotion in that market too. I'd be curious to know how you go about selling yourself in terms of getting the things that you feel are important to you. Yeah.
I would say, one, we can boast about the quality of the photography for photographs, the collection, the fact that our first photograph was purchased in 1934. We were collecting before, before MoMA, before the Whitney in terms of photography. The other, I think, that we use to promote ourselves or set ourselves apart for all media is the fact that we're a teaching museum. So not only will something enter what we think is a pretty great collection and be exhibited, but it also might be used in the Museum Learning Center. It will be used by classes, actively thought about and viewed in all different ways. The other thing is nothing in the museum is permanent. So we're always reinstalling. So anything that enters the collection will be used and will be up.
Right.
Rather than sit in storage.
But I would also add one thing that sets us apart, and that is it goes hand in hand with the fact that nothing is permanently installed, is that we don't, for lack of a better word, ghettoize photography in basement galleries. If you go to the Art Institute of Chicago, for example, you have to go to the basement. It's typically in the basement because they are almost always the last departments added to encyclopedic museums. And at the Addison, we don't have, there's never been that distinction between photography and the rest of our collection. So since we don't have things on view permanently, we are much more nimble and able to integrate photographs into really almost everything. So I think for artists to know that their photographs could be next to anything from a Jackson Pollock to a Winslow Homer is pretty thrilling to a number of them. So that ability to see things in different contexts, I think is exciting for some artists. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Our pleasure.
Until when is Lavon going to be there?
That's a good question. We haven't quite worked that out. He's off to LA this summer, but I'm thinking he might be here through July, definitely through June.
Ooh, great.
So come visit.
Yeah, I'm thinking of actually stopping through with JP on the way to something up in New Hampshire. So, and it's great to see everybody. Terrific to see you all.
You too.
I think Daisy, did you have a question? I saw something in the chat. You're muted.
There, is that better?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm actually Ellen.
Oh, sorry. Oh my God. Sorry. I saw Schnepple and I got confused. Sorry.
She couldn't come. She had other obligations. I had a question also about photography. I'm sorry that it's on photography and not other parts of your collection, but I'm wondering how you acquire photography in the sense that I'm very familiar with Walker Evans and Edward Curtis. And I know that a lot of their prints are available because I bought the very portrait of Walker Evans of the woman in front of her wooden house. And I turned it over and it was a Library of Congress print, I believe. So I guess you can acquire these elsewhere. So I'm wondering how you go about doing that if there are multiple prints of it or a finite number of prints. And is that a question that comes up when you're?
Well, so the Library of Congress prints are things you can order because the government owns anything he did for government work is owned by the government. So those negatives weren't his. So those prints can be ordered as modern prints. And those are things we would not collect for the museum. So what we're looking for are prints we know Evans printed, vintage prints or later prints, but printed by him that he printed and actually signed. So the Allie Mae that I showed is actually a vintage print signed by Walker Evans, which makes it different than the Library of Congress, which are wonderful. I have those too. But that's what sets that apart.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
There is, I think some institutions are more fanatical about the idea of vintage prints versus modern prints.
Right.
I think the kind of general rule of thumb I think that we go for is that we want to make sure that there's intentionality and that the artist, even if they were made posthumously, that the artist was involved in the discussions around how they should be made, that they're properly produced according to the standards of the photographer. But there's a lot. I mean, it is harder with photography. There isn't that sort of original, the kind of one unique piece in some cases that's not true with daguerreotypes.
Well, what's interesting about that is the Vivian Meyer, because those are modern prints made from the negatives that John Maloof purchased, and he never collaborated with Meyer. We don't know how she would prefer them printed. So that is an interesting sort of aberration there, where those are modern prints that are editioned and being printed, but contemporary and not by the artist.
An ethical question. As well.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting.
Feel free to unmute if you have any questions, but we won't force you to ask questions if you have any.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'd really like to thank Gordon and Allie for doing a great presentation today of our new acquisitions, or rather just a few of them. Thank you to the members of the audience who support the Addison regularly. And please, if you're in the area, perhaps coming back for a reunion, do stop into the Addison, see our new exhibitions. We'd love to see you back in Andover. Thank you, everyone. Take care now.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
you. Thank you.
Terrific.